They gave my mother 7 days to leave her home, not because she broke the law, because her rose bushes grew 4 inches too tall, 93 years old, 31 years in that house. She raised me in that house. She held my father's hand for the last time in that house. And Beverly Trout, white Cadillac, cream blazer, HOA president, didn't even have the decency to knock on the door, just sent the lawyers, slapped a 7-day eviction notice under the door of a 93-year-old woman, and called it repeat violation enforcement. The violations that got her there? A garden hose left on the driveway overnight, a Christmas wreath up 2 days too long, leaves in a gutter, in October. My mother called me that Wednesday night. Her voice was steady. That was the part that broke me. Beverly had no idea who she just picked a fight with, and by the time she figured it out, it was already too late to take any of it back. What would you do if they came for your mother like this? Drop it in the comments. And where are you watching from? My name is Garrett Wolfson. I spent 12 years as a Navy SEAL, 2 combat deployments, 1 stint training foreign special operations units in places I still can't name out loud. I've cleared rooms in the dark, navigated swamps that smelled like old death and motor oil, and sat very still for very long periods of time waiting for the right moment. Patience isn't something I learned at a seminar. It's something that got welded into my spine somewhere between BUD/S Hell Week and my 3rd deployment. I tell you that not to brag. I tell you that because it matters later. It really matters later. After I separated from the Navy, I came home to Millhaven Crossing, a mid-sized planned community in central North Carolina, population around 14,000. It's the kind of place that smells like cut grass and charcoal on Saturday mornings, where the hardware store still has a bulletin board with handwritten index cards. I moved back to be close to my mother, Dolores Wolfson, who had lived in her house on Pembroke Lane since 1993, 31 years. She knew every neighbor's name, every dog's name, every grandmother's birthday. The woman was the unofficial mayor of that street. The house itself was modest. 3 bedrooms, original hardwood floors that creaked in a comfortable way, a front yard that Dolores had turned into a genuine garden showpiece. Roses, hydrangeas, a little stone path she and my late father had laid one summer, using rocks they'd collected on road trips. She had a hand-painted wooden sign by the mailbox that said, "The Wolfson Place," in her own cursive. That sign had been there since 1994. Now, into this picture walks the antagonist. Her name was Beverly Trout, board president of the Millhaven Crossing Homeowners Association, elected 3 years running because nobody else wanted the job badly enough to show up to 3 HOA meetings in a row. She was mid-50s, perpetually dressed in cream-colored blazers, and she drove a white Cadillac SUV with a personalized plate that read BVRLEEEE. 5 E's. I counted. The extra E's told you everything. Beverly had been the HOA president since my mother's previous neighbor, a retired school principal named Herschel, moved to Florida. Herschel, by all accounts, had kept Beverly in check simply by being louder. Once Herschel left, Beverly grew. The way mold grows when the window's sealed and the heat's on. She began with small cruelties. She cited Dolores for a garden hose left coiled on the driveway overnight. She sent a written warning when Dolores's holiday wreath stayed up 2 days past the HOA's December 31st deadline, even though January 1st fell on a Sunday and my mother had been in the hospital with a respiratory infection. She dispatched the HOA's hired compliance officer, a part-time guy named Renwick who drove a golf cart and wore a reflective vest, to photograph Dolores's gutters and issue a formal notice about organic debris accumulation. That's leaves, folks. Leaves in gutters in October, in North Carolina. I watched all of this from a distance, calling my mother twice a week, filing the notices away in a folder I'd labeled, maybe a little darkly, for later. My mother, being Dolores, laughed it off. "She's just lonely," Mom said. "People who have to be in charge of something small are always lonely." But then came the roses. Dolores's roses grew along a decorative fence she'd had installed in 2001. The HOA's Architectural Guidelines, Section 4, Subsection C, Paragraph 2, stated that ornamental plantings along boundary fences shall not exceed 48 inches in height at any point. Dolores's roses, that spring, had reached 52 inches in 2 spots. 4 inches, the height of a soda can. Beverly didn't send a courtesy notice. She didn't knock on the door. She filed directly with the HOA's legal contractor, a firm in Raleigh that specialized in HOA enforcement, and activated a provision in the HOA's governing documents that allowed the association to pursue habitation restrictions for repeat violators. On the strength of 3 prior written notices, the hose, the wreath, the gutters, Beverly Trout had my 93-year-old mother declared a repeat offender and issued a 7-day notice to vacate. I found out on a Wednesday. My mother called me, not crying, just quiet. That quiet told me everything. I drove the 4 hours that night. I pulled into Pembroke Lane at 2:14 in the morning. The neighborhood was dark and still, just the hiss of sprinklers somewhere down the block and the smell of night-blooming jasmine from Mrs. Calloway's yard next door. I sat in the truck for a moment, just looking at my mother's house, the porch light she'd left on for me, the roses along the fence barely visible in the dark, 4 inches too tall, and apparently the most dangerous thing in Millhaven Crossing. Inside, my mother had coffee ready. At 2 a.m. She was wearing her bathrobe, and her reading glasses were pushed up on her forehead, the way she wore them when she was trying to look casual about being worried. She slid a cup across the table and said, "Now don't do anything dramatic." I told her I was going to read the paperwork first. The 7-day notice was 3 pages, single-spaced, and referenced the HOA's Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, the CC&Rs, extensively. The language was dense and legalistic, designed to intimidate rather than inform, but I'd done enough operational planning to know how to strip a document down to its bones. What I found in those bones was interesting. First, the notice cited 3 prior violations as the basis for repeat offender status, but 2 of those 3 violations, the hose and the wreath, had been resolved. My mother had paid the fines. Under standard contract law, a resolved violation that has been fined and paid generally cannot be relitigated as grounds for escalated enforcement. The HOA's lawyer had bundled resolved issues into a new claim as if they were still active. That's not just aggressive, that's potentially fraudulent. Second, the habitation restriction clause in the CC&Rs was real, but it required a board vote, a formal vote in a noticed meeting with minutes. I dug out the HOA's bylaws, which my mother had in a manila envelope in the kitchen drawer, like the organized woman she has always been. The bylaws required that any enforcement action involving habitation restrictions be approved by a majority of the full board, not just the president acting unilaterally. There were 5 board members. I needed to know if there had been a vote. I called the HOA management company's after-hours line at 7 a.m. and left a message requesting the meeting minutes for any board vote authorizing habitation restrictions against my mother. Then I drove to the county courthouse when it opened at 8:30 to pull the public records on the HOA's incorporation and any prior legal actions. This is something anyone can do, by the way. HOA governing documents, meeting minutes, and any related court filings are typically public record. You go to the county clerk's office, you ask for the HOA's registered documents, you pay the copy fee, and you leave with a paper trail. It takes 2 hours and costs about $12. Takeaway: your HOA's rules are a public document, and public documents can work both for and against the people who wrote them. What I found at the courthouse was a gift. Beverly Trout had filed the habitation restriction notice under her signature alone, on HOA letterhead, with no accompanying board resolution. No vote, no minutes, no quorum. Just Beverly, her signature, and a legal contractor who apparently didn't ask any questions. I drove back to Pembroke Lane and sat on my mother's porch, the boards still paint-chipped, still creaking the same way they had when I was 8 years old, and I called my buddy Thatcher, who'd gotten a law degree after leaving the Army, and now practiced real estate and contract law in Charlotte. I explained what I had. There was a brief silence. Then Thatcher said, "She filed a habitation restriction without a board vote? In North Carolina?" "Yep." "Garrett, that's not just unenforceable. Depending on how the CC and Rs are written, she may have just committed an unauthorized act under the association's own charter. That's potential personal liability for Beverly." I thanked him and told him I'd call back. That afternoon, I drove to Beverly Trout's house, a larger model on the premium side of the development. White shutters, pressure-washed driveway, the Cadillac in the garage. I knocked on the door. She answered in her cream blazer, like she'd been expecting a meeting. She looked at me, 6'2", 220 pounds, hair still military short, and for just a second, something flickered behind her eyes. "Miss Trout," I said pleasantly. "I'm Dolores Wolfson's son. I've reviewed the notice you sent her. I have a few questions about the board vote that authorized it." Another flicker. "The board supports all enforcement actions." "I'm sure they do," I said. "Can you tell me the date of the meeting where they voted on my mother's case specifically?" The pause was long enough to be its own answer. "I'll need to review my records," she said. "Of course," I said. "I'll give you a day." I smiled and walked back to my truck. Behind me, I heard her door close just a little too hard. Beverly did not spend that day reviewing her records. She spent it making phone calls. I know this because within 24 hours, two things happened. First, the HOA's Raleigh law firm sent a letter to my mother, doubling down on the 7-day notice and adding a new claim, that the stone path my parents had laid in the front yard violated impervious surface area guidelines in Section 6 of the CC&Rs. The stones had been there for 23 years. Nobody had complained in 23 years. Suddenly, they were a crisis. Second, I received a visit from Renwick, the compliance officer in the golf cart and reflective vest. He appeared at the end of my mother's driveway around 10 a.m., clipboard in hand, and began photographing the property with the energy of a man who'd been told his job depended on finding something. I watched him from the porch, coffee in hand. He photographed the roses. He photographed the stone path. He got out of the golf cart and walked the fence line, stopping to measure things with a tape measure. The tape measure was the detail that got me. Someone had briefed him specifically. I walked down the driveway. "Morning, Renwick." He startled. "Oh, I'm just conducting a routine compliance inspection." "Of course you are." I looked at his clipboard. "Is that a new inspection form? I don't see a notice of inspection." HOA bylaws require 48-hour written notice before a compliance inspection of an occupied residence. Renwick blinked. He was a retired postal worker, I'd learned, picking up some extra income. He was not malicious. He was just following instructions. "Ms. Trout called me this morning," he said, slightly helplessly. "I figured," I said. "Look, Renwick, I don't have a problem with you personally, but I need you to document in your report that this inspection was conducted without prior written notice. That's going to matter later." He wrote it down. I think he actually appreciated being told what to write. That afternoon, Thatcher drove up from Charlotte. We sat at my mother's kitchen table. Dolores made egg salad sandwiches, because that's what she does when there's business to conduct, and we laid out everything we had. The unauthorized board action, the retaliatory escalation, the uninstructed inspection. Thatcher had done his own digging. Under North Carolina General Statute Section 47F, the Planned Community Act, HOA boards are required to follow their own governing documents with fidelity. An enforcement action that bypasses required board approval is not just unenforceable. The statute provides that homeowners subjected to such actions may be entitled to recover attorney's fees and damages. Takeaway. In most states, HOAs are legally bound to follow their own rules, and violating those rules can expose board members to personal liability. There was more. Thatcher had pulled the HOA's most recent annual financial disclosure, another public document, required under NC law, filed with the county. The HOA had collected $847,000 in dues and fees over the prior year. Their reserve fund, which was supposed to cover major repairs like road repaving and the community pool, was sitting at $42,000. Legally, HOA reserve funds are supposed to be maintained at a level that covers anticipated expenses. $42,000 for a community this size was not just low, it was potentially negligent, or something worse. "Where's the money?" I asked. Thatcher tapped his pen on the table. "That's the right question." My mother looked up from her sandwich. "The pool was resurfaced 2 years ago," she said. "Beverly said it cost $380,000. Thatcher and I looked at each other. Resurfacing a community pool of standard size typically costs $15,000 to $40,000. Even a premium job, with full tile replacement and deck work, runs $80,000 to $120,000. A $380,000 pool resurfacing in a mid-sized North Carolina subdivision had exactly one explanation: Somebody's cousin did the work, or the money went somewhere else entirely. I asked my mother if she still had HOA meeting agendas from the past 2 years. She had them in the same manila envelope. She had everything. We identified the vendor, a company called Pristine Aquatic Solutions LLC, registered in 2021. 1 employee listed. The registered agent? A woman named Beverly Renee Trout. I set down my sandwich. The HOA president had directed $380,000 of community funds to a shell company she controlled. Thatcher, I said, is that fraud? He didn't even look up. Yeah, he said, that's fraud. We ate the rest of our sandwiches in thoughtful silence. My mother refilled everyone's coffee. Here's where most people would call the police and consider themselves done. And look, that was coming. But I've spent enough time in situations where moving too fast costs you the mission. You don't breach before the perimeter is set. You don't tip your hand before you're ready to play every card. So we didn't call anyone yet. Instead, I spent the next 3 days doing what I do best, gathering intelligence, systematically, without announcing myself. I'm going to walk you through what we did because every single step is something a regular person can do. No special clearances required. Step 1. I filed a North Carolina public records request for all HOA-related county filings in the past 5 years. This cost $8 and took 48 hours. What came back included the original Pristine Aquatic Solutions contract, signed by Beverly on behalf of the HOA, and the corresponding invoice, which was filed as a supporting document in the HOA's 2022 tax paperwork. The invoice was for $380,000. Pool rehabilitation and structural improvement services. The scope of work, 4 lines, vague as smoke. Step 2. I drove to the county assessor's office and pulled the permit records for the pool resurfacing project. Construction work above a certain dollar threshold in North Carolina requires a building permit. The pool job had a permit. The permitted value of the work? $31,500. The HOA paid $380,000 for $31,500 worth of permitted work. Takeaway: construction permits are public record, and permit values are one of the best ways to spot inflated contract billing. Step 3. I found the neighbors. This is the part where the military background isn't so much about tactics as it is about people. You learn, over 12 years of working with allied forces, interpreters, local community leaders. You learn how to walk into a room of strangers and make them trust you fast. I spent 2 evenings going door to door on the 3 streets nearest my mother's house. Not to gossip, not to recruit, just to ask one question. Has the HOA done anything to you or your property in the past 3 years that felt unfair or unexplained? I filled 3 pages of notes. There was a retired firefighter named Augusto, 2 streets over, whose detached garage had been cited for a structural non-compliance that required $12,000 in HOA-mandated repairs. Repairs he'd had to hire an HOA-approved contractor to do. The approved contractor charged nearly double market rate, and, when Augusto had looked into it, turned out to share an office address with Pristine Aquatic Solutions LLC. There was a widow named Nettie who'd been fined $3,200 over 18 months for various minor violations. She'd eventually just paid because she was 78 years old and fighting it felt impossible. She cried a little when I sat in her living room. She smelled like lavender and old grief, and she showed me her fine notices in a shoebox she'd kept under her bed. And she said, "I thought I was the only one." You're never the only one. That's the thing about petty tyrants. They always have more victims than anyone knows, because the victims all think they're alone. By the end of those 2 evenings, I had 12 neighbors willing to submit written statements about HOA enforcement actions they believed were selective, retaliatory, or financially suspicious. 12 people, and I hadn't even knocked on half the doors yet. Back on my mother's porch, I spread everything out. The county records, the permit discrepancy, the 12 neighbor statements, Thatcher's legal analysis, and the original 7-day notice. Dolores looked at the pile and said, "That seems like a lot of paperwork for 4 inches of roses." "It is," I said, "but now we use it." Meanwhile, Beverly wasn't sitting still. She'd apparently heard through the neighborhood grapevine, specifically through a woman named Priscilla who served on the social committee and had a mouth like a PA system, that I was going around talking to people. So Beverly did what petty authority always does when it feels threatened. She escalated. a new notice appeared on my mother's door. This one cited the stone path, the rose height, and added a brand new violation. Unapproved exterior modification. The hand-painted wooden sign by the mailbox. The Wolfson Place. The sign that had been there since 1994. My mother held the notice and looked at me. Her jaw was set. In 31 years, that sign had never come down. Not through hurricanes, not through grief, not through anything. She's trying to erase us, my mother said quietly. She wasn't wrong. And that was the last thing Beverly Trout was ever going to take from Dolores Wolfson. On day 5 of the 7-day notice period, Thatcher called me while I was doing a perimeter check of my mother's property. Old habit. I walk the line every morning, gravel crunching under my boots, just to think. He had something. Remember how the HOA filed those enforcement actions under Beverly's signature alone? He said. Yeah. I pulled the HOA's D&O insurance policy. Directors and officers' liability. It's what protects board members personally if they get sued for actions taken in their official capacity. And? The policy has an exclusion, a big one. He paused for effect. It explicitly excludes coverage for any board action taken outside the scope of the board's authority, meaning actions not approved by proper board vote. Beverly's unilateral filing isn't just unauthorized, it's uninsured. If your mother sues, Beverly isn't covered. She's personally on the hook. I stopped walking. The gravel was still under my feet. Somewhere nearby, a cardinal was doing its repetitive 2-note call, over and over. She doesn't know that, I said. Almost certainly not. Most board presidents assume the D&O policy covers everything they do. Here's why this matters, for anyone watching who lives in an HOA. D&O insurance is standard for HOA boards, but those policies almost always contain exclusions for unauthorized acts, fraud, and self-dealing. If a board member acts outside their authority, and especially if they're directing money to their own business, they're personally exposed. Takeaway: request your HOA's D&O insurance policy via public records or a written demand. Knowing its exclusions tells you exactly where a corrupt board member is vulnerable. But the deeper reveal was this. Thatcher had contacted the other 4 members of the HOA board. He identified them from public filings and reached out professionally, explaining that he represented a Millhaven Crossing homeowner and needed to discuss the legal posture of recent enforcement actions. 3 of the 4 called him back within 24 hours. All 3 said the same thing, essentially. They had not voted on any habitation restriction. They hadn't even been informed one was being filed. One of them, a man named Dorrance who joined the board 2 years ago with genuine intentions about improving the neighborhood, was particularly agitated. She told us it was a routine administrative matter, he said. She said she had authority to handle minor enforcement without a full vote. That was a lie. The bylaws were unambiguous. Dorrance asked Thatcher, with some urgency, whether the board members themselves could face liability for Beverly's unauthorized actions. Thatcher, being an excellent lawyer, explained that typically board members who neither authorized nor were aware of an unauthorized act have substantial protection, but that the situation needed to be corrected immediately and formally documented. He suggested Dorrance call an emergency board meeting. Dorrance called one for 2 days later. The 7-day deadline was in 4 days. We weren't going to wait for the meeting to be our only play. We needed Beverly off balance before she walked into that room. We needed her to believe, going into the meeting, that the scope of the problem was smaller than it actually was. Let her feel safe. Let her sharpen her knives for the wrong fight. My mother made sweet tea. We sat on the porch in the late afternoon heat, the thick, heavy heat of a North Carolina summer that sits on your shoulders like a wool coat. And we planned. The next 36 hours had the particular focused energy I remembered from pre-mission prep. That quiet hum of people who know exactly what they're doing and why they're doing it, moving through checklists with no wasted motion. Thatcher drafted a formal legal demand letter, not a complaint, not yet, just a letter, addressed to the HOA board collectively, referencing the unauthorized habitation restriction, the inspection notice violation, the permit discrepancy on the pool contract, and the conflict of interest created by Beverly's ownership of Pristine Aquatic Solutions, LLC. The letter requested, formally, that the 7-day notice be rescinded within 48 hours, that the HOA commission an independent financial audit, and that Beverly Trout recuse herself from all enforcement decisions pending the audit. It was measured, professional, and absolutely devastating in its specificity. Takeaway: a well-documented demand letter, sent before litigation, establishes your record, demonstrates good faith, and often forces a settlement, because it shows the other side exactly how much you know. While Thatcher worked on that, I drove to the local TV station. Millhaven Crossing had a regional news market, and I'd looked up the station's consumer affairs reporter, a woman named Sadie, who'd done a series 3 years prior on predatory HOA practices in the Raleigh-Durham metro. I called ahead, told her I had documents, told her there might be a financial fraud angle, and told her a 93-year-old woman was 7 days away from a legally manufactured eviction. Sadie was interested before I finished the sentence. I did not give her anything yet. I told her I'd call when the timing was right. She gave me her direct cell number and said, "Don't wait too long." Back at the house, I had 12 neighbor statements to organize. I formatted them into a single packet with a cover sheet, sequenced chronologically, with a 1-paragraph summary of each person's experience. Augusto's inflated contractor referral, Nettie's fine notices, 7 others with various versions of the same pattern. I printed 3 copies, one for Thatcher, one for the emergency board meeting, one for Sadie. Augusto came over that evening, bringing 2 other neighbors, a landscaper named Birch, who'd been on the receiving end of a selective mowing violation, and a retired school teacher named Wanda, who'd had her fence color cited as non-compliant after she declined to buy cookies for the HOA's social committee. We sat in my mother's living room, the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead, and I walked through the plan. The physical component, and yes, there's a physical component, because you have to be able to see something to believe it, was this: my mother's roses. Beverly's entire case rested on those roses being 52 inches tall. The HOA's own rules specified that the measurement was to be taken from ground level to the highest natural growth point. I had read that clause 4 times. It said natural growth point. It did not say the highest point achievable with climbing support, which was what Beverly's compliance officer had measured. He'd measured to where the roses had grown up along the fence rail, which was artificially elevated. Measured correctly from the actual base growth, 2 of the 3 flag spots were at or below 48 inches. Only 1 exceeded the limit by less than 2 inches. I'd already had a licensed landscape architect come out, a woman named Cressida, who Thatcher knew from a prior case, and she'd provided a written measurement certification on professional letterhead. Takeaway: when an HOA cites you for a measurement-based violation, hire a licensed professional to certify the actual measurement. Professional certifications carry weight that a compliance officer with a tape measure doesn't. The trap, if you want to call it that, was simple. Let Beverly walk into the emergency board meeting confident she had a solid case on the roses. Let her argue the violation, then present the certified measurements showing her compliance officer had measured wrong. Watch her entire legal justification for the habitation restriction collapse in front of the other 4 board members, the attending homeowners, and, once I made the call, a TV camera. Wanda, sitting across from me in my mother's living room, leaned forward and said, "What do you need from us?" "I need you all at the board meeting," I said. "I need you visible, and I need you to let me do the talking until it's time for each of you to say one thing." Augusto cracked his knuckles. "I can do one thing." My mother came in with a plate of oatmeal cookies and said, "Who wants decaf?" The day before the emergency board meeting, Beverly made her first truly desperate move. She contacted 3 of the 12 neighbors who'd given me statements. Not Augusto. She probably sensed that was a dead end. She went after Nettie and 2 others, a couple named the Fairweathers, who'd complained about selective enforcement of parking rules. She visited them personally, in the white Cadillac, in the cream blazer. She brought a plate of baked goods, store-bought brownies on a good plate, the kind of move that only works on people who've never seen it before. I know what she said to Nettie because Nettie called me afterward, voice tight with something between anger and embarrassment. Beverly had told her that a developer from Raleigh was looking at Millhaven Crossing as an acquisition target, and that any public controversy about the HOA's management could suppress property values across the board. She implied Nettie's home value could drop. She implied Nettie could lose money she couldn't afford to lose. To a 78-year-old widow living on a fixed income, that's not just intimidation. That's a targeted strike at the thing she can least afford to gamble on. Nettie had listened politely. She'd thanked Beverly for the brownies. She'd closed the door. And then she'd called me and said, "I'm still coming to the meeting, and I want to say more than one thing." The Fairweathers held firm too. Beverly had apparently tried a different angle with them, suggesting that their statement might be misinterpreted and create legal exposure for them personally. It was a bluff so empty it practically rattled when she said it, but she was running out of other moves. What she didn't know was that both of those conversations had been partially overheard by neighbors, who then texted others in the informal neighborhood group chat, a chat that I had been quietly added to 3 days earlier by Birch, the landscaper, who had very helpfully not announced my addition to anyone. So I was reading the real-time play-by-play of Beverly working her pressure campaign, in near real time, from my mother's porch. Watching a panicking opponent make bad moves is one of the most satisfying experiences available in this life. She was running hot. When people run hot, they make more mistakes. That night, she made another one. She called Renwick and told him to conduct a final compliance inspection the following morning, the morning of the meeting, without notice, to generate fresh documentation of the violations. She wanted current photographs that the board could see, taken that same day, to neutralize any argument that the issue had been resolved. Renwick called me. He'd gotten my number from Augusto, apparently. He said, "She's asking me to do another unannounced inspection." I looked it up. The bylaws say 48-hour notice. I don't want to do anything illegal. "Renwick," I said, "you're a good man. Don't do the inspection." "What do I tell her?" "Tell her the bylaws require notice and you're not comfortable proceeding without it. Say it by text so you have a record." He did. She apparently responded with a string of capital letters that Renwick described, with evident discomfort, as pretty intense. But she couldn't force him. He was a part-time contractor, not an employee, and he'd just developed a sudden appreciation for the nuances of HOA compliance procedure. The morning of the meeting, I called Sadie at the TV station. I told her the meeting was at 7 p.m. in the Millhaven Crossing Community Center, and that she'd want a camera there. I told her about the financial angle, the pool contract, the permit records, the LLC, and I told her that if she pulled those public documents before the meeting, she'd have everything she needed to go on air, regardless of what happened in the room. She pulled them. She texted me at 4 p.m. "I have the permit records. This is big. We'll be there." I got dressed. My mother put on a blue dress she usually saved for church. We drove to the community center together, the evening light going golden over the cornfields at the edge of the development, the truck smelling of her perfume and the leather of the seats, and something older, something like purpose. "Are you nervous?" she asked me. "No," I said. She patted my arm. "Good, neither am I." The Millhaven Crossing Community Center was a rectangular building with fluorescent lights and folding chairs, and a water-stained ceiling tile above the emergency exit. It smelled like coffee from an industrial urn, and the particular staleness of a room that only gets used 6 times a year. By 6:45, it was standing room. 43 homeowners by my count. I'd trained myself to do a fast head count walking into any space, old habit. Plus Thatcher. Plus the 4 cooperating board members seated at the folding table at the front. Plus Renwick, standing near the back wall with his arms crossed, looking like a man who had decided which side of history he wanted to be on. Beverly arrived at 6:55, 5 minutes before the meeting. She walked in with the confidence of someone who doesn't know the room has already turned. She'd brought the HOA's Raleigh lawyer, a thin man in a blue suit named Pittman, who looked at the crowd and did a visible recalculation. I had positioned myself in the second row, not the first. You don't sit in the front row when you want to observe the whole room. Beverly saw me. Our eyes met. She looked away first. Dorrance, the board member who'd called Thatcher, gavelled the meeting to order. He was a steady man, mid-40s, the kind of guy who coaches Little League and shows up to city council meetings when there's a zoning issue. He read a statement indicating that the emergency meeting had been called to address concerns about the procedural validity of recent enforcement actions, and that the board welcomed community input. Beverly immediately tried to take control. She stood up and said she wanted to present documentation of ongoing violations to justify the enforcement actions in question. Dorrance said, "We'll get there. First, I have a procedural question." He looked directly at Beverly. "Can you provide the minutes from the board meeting where a majority vote authorized the habitation restriction filed against Dolores Wolfson?" Silence. Pittman, the lawyer, leaned toward Beverly and said something in a low voice. Beverly said, The board president has executive authority to initiate enforcement procedures. Dorrance looked at the bylaws document he had in front of him. I had given Thatcher a copy to share with the board members, and they had read it. Not for habitation restrictions. That requires a full board majority vote. Can you provide those minutes? The board was informed. Informed is not the same as voting, Dorrance said. He had a voice that didn't rise, didn't perform. He just stated facts. It was deeply effective. This was the moment where Pittman, the HOA's lawyer, should have stepped in and saved his client. Instead, he made a fascinating calculation. He asked to speak as an officer of the court and said that upon reviewing the documents provided to him that afternoon, Thatcher had sent him our full packet at 3 p.m. as a professional courtesy because Thatcher is a thoroughgoing professional. He had advised his client that the habitation restriction as filed was not defensible and that he would not be representing the HOA in any litigation arising from it. He was withdrawing, in the meeting, in front of everyone. Beverly's face did something complicated. Thatcher stood up from his seat beside me and introduced himself as legal counsel for Dolores Wolfson and placed a copy of the formal demand letter on the board table. He walked through it, calm, measured, lethal. The unauthorized action, the inspection violations, the permit discrepancy, the LLC. He put up the LLC registration on a projector screen he'd connected to his laptop. Beverly Renee Trout, registered agent. He put up the pool contract, $380,000. He put up the building permit, $31,500. The room did not erupt. It went very quiet, the way rooms go quiet when something irrevocable has just happened, and everyone is processing what they've witnessed. Nettie stood up. Her voice was steady. She said 4 sentences. She said she had been fined $3,200 over 18 months for violations she believed were targeted. She said she had the documentation. She said she was 78 years old, and she was tired of being afraid of her own neighborhood. She sat back down. Augusto stood. Birch stood. Wanda stood. Wanda spoke for all 3 of them. We want an independent audit. We want it now. Dorrance looked at his fellow board members. They nodded. Moved and seconded, he said. All in favor? 4 hands went up simultaneously. Beverly did not raise hers. That's when I walked to the front of the room. I didn't hurry. I set the folder, the one with the certified landscape measurements, the public records, the neighbor packet, on the table in front of the board. I looked at Beverly Trout, and I used my quiet voice. The same voice I used in rooms where I needed people to understand that what was happening was serious and final, and not subject to negotiation. Ms. Trout, I want to address the original violation cited in my mother's 7-day notice, the rose height. She had visibly steadied herself. The cream blazer was still straight. She was not a woman who folded easily, I'll give her that. The measurements are documented, she said. They are, I said, and I have them here. I pulled out Cressida's certified measurement report. A licensed landscape architect conducted a professional measurement per the CC&R's own specification, from ground level to natural growth point, not to the fence rail height. Would you like to see what she found? I didn't wait for a yes. I put the report on the projector. At 2 of the 3 flagged points, 46.5 inches and 47 inches, under the 48-inch limit. At the 3rd point, 49.25 inches, 1¼ inches over, 1 spot, 1 inch and a quarter. That was the entirety of the physical violation, the thing that had been used to brand my 93-year-old mother a repeat offender and begin the process of forcing her from the home she'd lived in for 31 years. The room made a sound, not a gasp, more like a collective exhale that carried a lot of meaning. 1¼ inches, I said, not 4 inches. The compliance officer's measurement technique was incorrect. And I have his inspection report here, which documents that the inspection was conducted without the required 48-hour notice, meaning it's procedurally invalid regardless. I looked at Pittman, the HOA's lawyer. He was writing something in his notepad. He was not making eye contact with anyone. Then the door at the back of the room opened. Sadie from the regional news station came in with a camera operator. She'd been waiting in the parking lot, per my suggestion. You don't want a TV camera to change the dynamic of the meeting before the key evidence is presented, but you do want it there for the aftermath. She set up quietly near the back, the camera light going on with a low hum. Beverly saw it. Something went out of her face. Dorrance, who knew the press was coming because I'd told him, and he'd agreed it was appropriate given the public interest in HOA finances, did not even look up. He said, "Board motion. The 7-day notice issued to Dolores Wolfson is hereby rescinded, effective immediately, and declared procedurally invalid." 4 hands. Carried. Board motion. Beverly Trout is hereby placed on administrative leave from all board duties, pending the results of the independent financial audit, consistent with our ethics policy. 4 hands. The vote was so fast it sounded like one motion. Beverly stood up. "You can't." "We can," Dorrance said. "It's in the ethics policy. You helped write it." He held up the document. He dog-eared the page. "I have to tell you, that was the mic drop moment. Not a dramatic speech, not a courtroom thunderclap, just a calm man in a folding chair holding up a piece of paper the villain had written and using it to end her." Beverly Trout gathered her things. She walked toward the back of the room. The crowd parted. Not dramatically, just naturally, the way people move when they want distance from something. The camera was rolling. At the door, she turned. I don't know what she intended to say. Whatever it was, she looked at the room. 43 neighbors, a TV camera, 4 former allies at the front table, and she said nothing. She walked out. The door swung closed. Outside, I heard the Cadillac start. I walked back to where my mother was sitting in the 3rd row. She looked up at me with an expression I recognized, the one she used when something she'd expected to be difficult turned out to be exactly as difficult as she'd expected, no more. "So we can keep the roses?" she said. "You can keep the roses, Mom." She nodded once, like that settled it, and reached into her purse for her car keys. Sadie caught up to us in the parking lot. She asked my mother if she'd be willing to say a few words on camera. My mother straightened her blue dress and said, "I suppose I could spare a minute." She was on the 10 o'clock news that night. She was composed, warm, and completely devastating. She said, "I planted those roses with my husband, God rest him, and I intend to see them bloom one more time. That's all I wanted." The clip got 2.1 million views. The independent audit came back 6 weeks later. Pristine Aquatic Solutions, LLC, had been paid $380,000 for pool work valued, professionally and conservatively, at $34,000. The remaining $346,000 was characterized in the audit as unsubstantiated service charges, which is auditor language for "we cannot find what this money bought." The audit also identified $87,000 in additional payments to 2 other vendors with undisclosed relationships to Beverly. The North Carolina Attorney General's office opened an investigation. Beverly Trout resigned from the HOA board 11 days after the community center meeting and retained a criminal defense attorney. As of the time of this recording, the matter remains under investigation, so I'm going to leave the legal outcome where it legally stands. But I'll say this: the documents are public record. The audit is public record, and the outcome I expect from that combination is the outcome you would expect. Dorrance was elected board president. He posted the new board's contact information, meeting schedule, and governing documents on a community website accessible to all residents. He sent a letter to every homeowner in Millhaven Crossing, explaining what had happened, apologizing on behalf of the board for the lack of oversight, and outlining the new procedures in plain language. Nettie got her $3,200 back. The board passed a resolution authorizing restitution to homeowners who'd been fined under enforcement actions now deemed procedurally invalid. She called me when the check arrived and cried a little, happy crying. The lavender smell of her living room and the shoebox under her bed felt very far away from where we were now. The stone path is still in my mother's front yard. The hand-painted sign, the Wolfson Place, is still by the mailbox. The roses are blooming this spring in spectacular, rule-adjacent fashion. My mother has been invited to speak at the county's HOA Reform Town Hall in the fall, and she's already planning what to wear. As for the community benefit, Augusto, Birch, Wanda, and 8 other neighbors formed a non-profit called the Millhaven Commons Fund. With a portion of the recovered HOA funds, designated for community benefit by the court pending Beverly's case, they've seeded a scholarship for Millhaven Crossing residents pursuing trade certifications and 2-year degrees. First recipient, a 19-year-old named Corliss who wants to be an electrician. The fund also bankrolled the first Pembroke Lane Garden Festival, A fall event where residents brought plants, seeds, and cuttings to trade, free to anyone in the neighborhood. My mother judged the rose competition. She gave first place to Mrs. Calloway next door, who had the decency to look surprised. Here's what I need you to take away from this. If you live in an HOA community, your HOA's governing documents are public records. Pull them. Read them. Know Section 4 before Beverly does. Know that enforcement actions require procedure, and procedure is your friend when it's ignored by the people enforcing it. Know that D&O insurance has exclusions. Know that construction permits tell the truth about what things actually cost. Know that you are not alone. Every Nettie in every neighborhood thinks she's the only one, and she's never the only one. And know that 7 days is enough time. For the right person, with the right documents, 7 days is plenty.
7 days, that's all it took. 7 days to unravel 3 years of someone else's power trip. Beverly walked out of that room without a word. 43 neighbors watched her go. Nobody cheered. The room just settled, like something that had been holding its breath for a long time finally let go. Here's what I keep thinking about. Garrett drove for hours in the middle of the night, not because he had a plan, because his mother called and her voice was steady. That's what the part that broke him. A 93-year-old woman trying not to sound scared on the phone. That's all it took to set this whole thing in motion, and Dolores never asked him to fight. She just made coffee, set out the paperwork, let him read. He won because he paid $12 at the county clerk office, because a $380,000 pool contract had a permit on file for $31,500, because Nettie has been keeping 3 years of fines in a shoebox under her bed, 2 trips away from 7 other people with the same shoebox. Petty power survives because it keeps people thinking they are alone. They never are. If the HOA has ever handed you something that felt wrong, drop it in the comment. You might be closer to back up than you think. Share this if someone needs to hear it. Subscribe for more. The roses are still on the Pembroke land. Dolores made sure of that.